very good afternoon to everyone here, our viewers, our esteemed speaker, my colleagues. Welcome everyone to this session today, hosted by the Economic Justice Conclave. I am Vedika and I'll be moderating the session today. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today's speaker is Kathy Walkling, co-founder EcoFemme. Hi Kathy, how are you doing?
Hi, Vedika. I'm very well, thank you.
I'd also extend a very warm welcome to President Ejcon, Anunita Jena. Over to you.
Thank you, Vedika. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. We at Sarla Modi School of Economics, NMIMS, started the Economic Justice Conclave last year as part of Kaching, our annual fest. The aim was to bring together people from all walks of life to share their experience and help address a socio-economic issue at hand. Last year, we tried to combat the climate crisis, and this year we are tackling the inequalities we face across various spectra. The issue of inequality is universal, within and between countries. This month's theme is to challenge gender inequality. Our first webinar was on the optimism in gender differences. Today we are addressing the stigma around menstruation. For millions of women and girls, there is no toilet, no sexuality education, no menstrual hygiene supplies, and at times no knowledge about what it means to have your period, let alone that it's something normal and natural. Menstrual hygiene is a harbinger of gender equality. It depends upon equal access to the right types of sanitation facilities, accurate information shared by men and women alike, and shared ownership from men and women across sectors and government ministries. Today, we are extremely honored to have amongst us Ms. Kathy, co-founder of EcoFemme, to talk about this issue and educate us on how we can bring about a change. Before handing over the platform to Vedika, I thank you all and hope that you enjoy the session. You can send in your questions throughout the seminar and we will be addressing them at the end. Thank you.
As Ms. President already mentioned, we'll be discussing menstruation and menstruators today. And the session is called Menstruation Matters, period. But before we get into the conversation, I'd like to introduce EcoFemme and its co-founder, Kathy Walkling. EcoFemme was founded in 2010. A very congratulations, ma'am. You completed a decade this year.
Thank you.
Other than that, EcoFemme started as an empowerment program promoting green menstruation, wherein cloth pads were promoted and women were empowered, educated, employed, all of them to help them adapt to menstruation better, educate themselves about how to handle menstruation and embrace their femininity. Kathy Walkling moved to India from Australia in 1997 and has been here since. She has been working towards this movement of women empowerment and green menstruation throughout this decade with her co-founder, Jasmine. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining us today. And just like history says, the Dravidian India was always very comfortable with discussing menstruation, or not comfortable. They cherished menstruation. It was celebrated in India, but the Aryan Indians did not find it very acceptable. It was a taboo, and it still remains in the country, not only among women, but every person who goes through menstruation, including the trans women. How do you address this stigma with sensitivity?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the whole topic of menstruation has become a kind of taboo in the culture. And I think there's particularities of it in India, but to be honest, it's actually a global phenomenon. We've been really uncomfortable with, I think, for anything to do with women's bodies for a long time. And this, you can see this whether it comes to sort of childbirth or something like menstruation. And with menstruation in particular, I think there's these roots in the ideas of purity and pollution. And this is making it a particularly sensitive topic in India to address. What we've learned, like, I think you're speaking to the question of how does one even begin to engage these conversations when there's been such a silence and rejection of the experience for so long. And we also started out being, really a bit nervous about it. And I guess just to say, like, obviously I'm a foreigner, so I think that it's led myself and my co-founder to be even more sensitive to the fact that we're stepping into a culture that's not our own. And for that reason, we work very closely with a grassroots organization, which was actually where EcoFemme started, was with an NGO that was working with self-help groups and women's empowerment. And we began to ask this question, how do women relate to menstruation? And what we sort of realized is that, first of all, there was a lot of anxiety about whether you can even have this conversation. And so we sort of tentatively set out to create a space which was really rooted in these values of, I'd say, curiosity, humility, and empathy. Just really not coming in as experts, but really wanting to understand and to learn what is the lived experience. And our experience of doing that and getting groups together and just asking questions with this curiosity and humility was that there was a great interest and wish for women to share about their experience. And not only was it not difficult to break the ice, but it was received so enthusiastically. Like, for most of the people we spoke to, they were saying this is the first time anyone's ever asked us about this experience, and they had a lot to say. So what we really learned, and of course we've done these kind of groups and conversations in many different places and with many partners, and we've realized this is a universal phenomenon. And I think it's a human phenomenon when we're really related to with genuine curiosity and with humility, where there's not this presumption of I know what your experience is, but I want to learn what your experience is. I think these really open doors to sharing and engagement. So I think this was sort of the big discovery right under our noses, is it doesn't require a special skill set or to have a special degree. It just requires these human qualities of stepping aside from your assumptions and engaging from the heart in a human way.
So from what I gathered, you needed to have a lot of empathy and a lot of patience when you started addressing this stigma, right? So it must have been like exponentially harder when you started out, because
Yes.
it was a new conversation at that time. In 2010, it was very new and not very easy to hold this conversation. So how did you manage to take off? How did you manage to procure enough resources to actually start something like EcoFemme that time?
Yes. Well, you're absolutely right. When we started, there really wasn't much precedent and there was not much also existing knowledge. So we kind of had to make it up as we went along. And, I'm based in Oroville, which is a very fertile place for social enterprises. So this has, I think, been a great set of conditions where we could begin with. And I guess we were lucky. Like, we really didn't set out with a lot of ambitions. We were curious to introduce and see what would happen with cloth pads in India, because myself and my co-founder, we were very aware of the problem of disposal of disposable sanitary napkins. And this was really at a time when nobody was speaking about the plastics and the issue of disposal. In fact, on the contrary, it was a time when everyone was being encouraged to start using disposable products. So we faced a number of challenges. The main challenge on the product side was kind of this thing, if you want us to go back to the drudgery of using cloth. So we had a lot of pushback on the product side. And we kind of, knew that we were really kind of on our own, and it would really probably take a lot of time and a lot of patience, as you said, to really get this message across. And at the same time, I think we also version never works. It might work in the short run, but really people have to understand and be convinced from their own sensibilities and their own heart why they would even make the switch. So we realized the conversation around menstruation and product really went hand in hand. We couldn't just go in with a cloth pad and say, here, you should use this. This was absolutely impossible. It really meant these deep conversations of, first of all, earning the trust of the women to be able to even speak openly about their experience, and then to start to explore what is the you know, what are the products they're using, what are the challenges they're facing. And we really understood through those conversations the multidimensional aspect of menstruation, that it touches on culture, you know, economics, health, environment, gender. All these topics are really meet at this kind of convergence point. So that was really interesting. And the more we understood that, the more we could formulate a project that we could really start communicating a holistic vision, which would actually get people to invest in and trust what we were doing. But to be perfectly honest, we started with very little. We just got a very small loan within Oroville, a soft loan. It was, I think, 3 lakhs. And I think in many ways, EcoFemme has been a great success story of starting with a dream and not having to have all the money all together and have the whole roadmap figured out. We just went slow and careful, taking the time to have these conversations, using the resources that were at our disposal, researching as we went along so we would build evidence. And on that basis, we started to get more and more understanding and confidence, and people responded to this approach. And then we attracted more support and guidance and a little bit more funding. And this was how we grew.
That is actually quite like a decade-long journey, ma'am. Yeah, thanks for putting light on that. So, of course, then your model, your business model has 2 aspects then, right? So one of it is a social movement. Like you said, you started having conversations, you were educating women on the way, and alongside building a model that could help you launch a product that would be acceptable in the market. So how do you balance these 2 dimensions? Because according to economics, like when you make profit, the social approach of your business is compromised, right? So how do you balance these 2 aspects of a business?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, I think first of all, it was having a very clear vision that we wanted to do it. And that we, you know, like if that was our goal, then we had to kind of figure out a way. And I think some of it has been good luck and probably some of it has been good strategy as well. But what we did was we envisioned a model that would include a commercial income generating stream. And based on that, we would be able to do our non-commercial work. And this is the essence of, I think, the social enterprise model, which I personally just love that idea. I'd worked in NGOs and I could see how tiring it was to be constantly with your begging bowl trying to get funding to do social good. So first of all, I'm a huge fan of the model of social enterprise. And unfortunately, again, we had a product that had commercial viability. And I'm just actually physically going to show for anyone, in case anyone doesn't know what we're talking about. It's this very simple, low-tech product stitched by rural women. It's a cloth reusable pad. And it just has some simple design elements of leak-proofing, wings, and it just takes the traditional practice of cloth into a functional design which is you know, useful and can work as a menstrual product. So with this product, we first of all, again, perhaps because we were foreigners and in a place like Oroville, but we also realized that there was certainly market potential abroad. What we were more curious about is whether we could launch it in the Indian marketplace. But again, like I said earlier, because we understood the issue of sanitary waste, we realized we had to try. So we really put our efforts in, but the low-hanging fruit for us was actually the international market. So we actually started to market this product globally, in India and abroad. And because of the international sales, which continue to this day to be a bigger market share for us than domestic, we've been able to also create a program which we call Pad for Pad, which means that every person abroad who buys one of these actually buys 2 pads, one for themselves and one for a young woman in India. And out of this, we really built our non-profit program called Pad for Pad, which meant, and what we did with that is combine their menstrual health education with a kit of cloth pads and offered these to girls as part of an educational program. So this is a very direct way where our commercial operations provided the revenue stream to do this program. And just to give you an idea of numbers, last year we reached nearly 13,000 girls, which meant that we had about 50,000 cloth pad donations through our international sales. So this is one way. I think it was really thinking about where can you make the money and what do you want to do with it, really, that does this
Right.
social good. And within India, we didn't apply the pad for pad donation because you realize it would make the product too expensive. And it was hard enough to convince Indian women to go back to cloth. So it's been a much harder product to market in India than it has abroad. But again, just to add one more piece, that I think having this story that when we can go into a village and talk to the women and girls and explain to them that this is not just a product that we're trying to push on rural women, because this is their first idea, but actually women all over the world are using this. It becomes aspirational in their mind. They realize this has something of an aspirational value. It's not just a poor woman's product. So it's a total reframe. So this is another way conceptually as well as financially where our model enabled us to really have, the left hand feeding the right hand, you could say. And these two really went in partnership. And the last thing I'll say about that is that I think from the point of view of the team and the whole enterprise, it has given so much more life to the enterprise because our team is divided also kind of 50-50 between our commercial and non-commercial operations.
Right.
And I know that it's very obvious to me that our commercial team wouldn't find it nearly as interesting to do, market and sell cloth pads if it wasn't for this. It's because of this non-profit work that they're serving the rural population in such a meaningful way that they're energized to do go out there and sell and market and promote the product. So I do think it's a very beautiful model, and it really can help the whole team and a whole economic model to have, a deep mission connect that's deeper than just selling a product.
So if I got it right, these are two dimensions that are more complementary than contradictory, right? So you need both of to keep you motivated and to keep you driven to maybe do more business, if you will, right?
Exactly. Well said.
So when you started, did you originally plan to have women employed in the production model, or did you look going to, expanding on economies of scale or something like that? Did you approach some factory outlet to produce, or was this the original plan? How did it come about?
Yeah, actually, to be honest, the seed really came. As I mentioned, I was working in an NGO and we were trying to actually fundraise for the NGO. And this is where I realized that being dependent on institutional donors to keep an NGO running was very difficult. And that's why I got excited about social enterprise. And this organization had trained women in tailoring. They were churning out all these women who could stitch, but they didn't have a product to stitch and they didn't have market to reach products to. So for me, this was the missing piece. It's like, well, there's already a pool of talented women ready to make something. What could it be? And to be honest, the cloth pad thing was really kind of random. I myself got excited about cloth pads as a product 10 years earlier when I'd been traveling in New Zealand, and I bought my first cloth pad and I was like, wow, this is such a great product. So I'd been using cloth pads and making them for women in Oroville for 10 years prior to setting up EcoFemme. And it was just this connect of looking for livelihood opportunities for these women who were skilled in tailoring to sell, to make something that had a market potential. So this was really it. It was really just taking all these threads and weaving them together. And it was much more of a sort of modest idea. Initially, I thought, well, we train these women in to stitch the cloth pads. It's not that difficult. I mean, look, it's not rocket science, right? And so we teach them, and on our end, they can stitch. We try to find market, and this was the model. Now, in fact, it was a couple of, and again, the whole thing's just been really organic. And then we started to learn also through these conversations about how menstruation was held in the culture and the challenges and the whole, the menstrual kind of practices and how some women found it restrictive, and the taboo and how girls were not properly educated. So this picture emerged much later. It wasn't that we went in knowing all of that, but as we learned about it and understood it, we felt, gosh, we have much more capacity here to do something interesting than just manufacturing these. So, and honestly, it was sort of like one step forward here, one step forward there. So as we started to develop the nonprofit ideas, we obviously needed more pads for that. And gradually, right now, we have 4 production units. They're all local to us in Oroville, so we work with local livelihood. They're almost all women. I believe now there's sort of 2 or 3 men who may be stitching in some of these units, but otherwise they're all women. They're not our employees. They have their own organisational structure, whether it's through an NGO or a small local company. And so we've negotiated per piece rates with them and quality parameters, and we just give them monthly production orders. So this is how it works. Our model is not the employment of women, but it's providing living wage to women through their production activity. But they're not EcoFemme staff. Our main activity is really education, sales and marketing.
I see. So now we've spoken so much about, menstruation and an entire business model that is normalizing menstruation. There are still 2 gender communities, in my opinion, that is still very difficult to, wrap your head around. For example, one of them would be the male population that finds it very difficult to hold a conversation about menstruation. And another conversation that we find it very difficult to conduct is the trans menstruators. These are 2 communities where menstruation is a no-no. We are not able to normalize menstruation among these 2 gender communities. How to do that? How to do that?
Again, to be honest, I think the principles are the same as how we started with women. I think, first of all, there's a tendency to think in terms of specific identities. And I believe there's something true in that too. There are maybe different ways to open conversations, but in a sense, I think it's a human conversation. This is a human issue. And of course, somebody who's experiencing menstruation in their body is going to have a different relationship to it than somebody who doesn't. And I think that has to be acknowledged, and it would be unfair to disregard that experience as being on the same level as somebody who doesn't. But to say that somebody who doesn't have that experience doesn't have anything to say. So let's talk about men and boys, for example. I think that what we're really seeing is that there's a great need to shift culture around this. We are at a time in our evolution, in our history globally, I think, where we're starting to see the kind of price we're paying for gender inequity in all over the place. Like we're suffering actually, and we're suffering on every end of that spectrum. Nobody's sort of not suffering. So I really feel, and I suppose I'm really a humanist in this, and I think the first thing is that with men and boys, we have to start normalizing these conversations at a really local and household level. And recognizing that it's not just a secret, private issue of women. So, but I think women have a great role to play in this. And again, I would go back to the same principles: curiosity, empathy, respect, and humility. It's the same thing. So, if you're a guy and, when you've never talked to any woman about this, whether it's your sister, your mother, your friend, I challenge you to take a risk and open that conversation and go in there with as much curiosity and humility as possible. Say, look, maybe I'm embarrassed to say it, but I've never been properly educated. I've never had a conversation, but I'm really dying to know, tell me about your experience. What's it like? And my experience is that, women who menstruate are more than happy to have those conversations. I think if we're related to on a human level, there's nothing hardly more satisfying than having a deep and intimate and authentic conversation about our lived experience. So I think we have to, just take it off the unreachable shelf and say, this is a conversation we can all be engaging. And similarly, for women, if you've never talked to a guy about your menstrual experience, I invite you and challenge you to start somewhere safe, somewhere comfortable. Maybe it's with your husband, or maybe it's a close friend. But just to sort of say, next time, maybe when you have your period, just let somebody know I'm menstruating and this is what's going on for me. I think we all just have to get more at ease with having this conversation. So this is maybe more to speak. I don't think there's any magic formula, and we have to almost demystify what this requires. Now, with trans men, and I think that this is sort of something that's really coming more into the focus now in the last couple of years. I know when we started our own work, I didn't know much about it myself. I had to look up what even is a trans man. And I think there's sometimes even a lot of embarrassment to admit we don't know. So I think one thing is just genuinely getting educated and learning, for example, that what a trans man is somebody who was born in as a biological woman, but has identified themselves as a man. So because they have the genitalia of a woman, they will usually experience menstruation, but they don't identify with that gender. So sometimes the languaging around menstruation, when it's only referred to as a women or girls issue, can feel exclusive for them. So I think this is something we're all getting more and more familiar with, and wrapping our heads around, that there is a need to kind of take into consideration that there are other menstruators who are not necessarily men, not necessarily women and girls, who are sharing this phenomenon, and how can we be more sensitive to that. But again, I would say it's a human issue of humility, curiosity, empathy. I'll always come back to these values.
Thank you so much. So we are going forward with curiosity, empathy, and a lot of humility when we are holding such conversations. And I've noted that down. Won't forget.
Great.
And next time I have a conversation, I'm going to make sure I embody all those things. Thank you so much. So we'll take some questions from the audience. So this is a question from Isha Sheikh. She says, actually, it's quite relevant to all of us here. All of us are living in hostels, or we are paid guests at some place or the other, and we are sharing rooms with other girls. We are living in a dorm setup, and in such a scenario, it becomes really difficult to use a cloth pad, because sanitation, it requires maintenance. And since I'm not the only person living there, it is doubly difficult for me to, maybe wash it, use it again, and maintain it. Is this just like how do I go about using a cloth pad in like a collective setup?
Yeah, good question, and a common question and a valid question. I think first of all, it is a behaviour change, and it may present additional challenges. I think one of the things that's first of all about if we're used to using disposables, I think one thing is it's a bit of an optical illusion that it's super convenient and, we've gotten rid of the product when we've thrown it away. And we haven't actually. We've just passed the burden downstream. So I think one thing is we have to be really clear about why we would even think about using a cloth pad, and, and really go through that process and that questioning inside to say, well, is it, and to really kind of get to the point where we decide that we want to do it, because it's not just like I've been told it's the right thing to do, but inside I really understand that I want to take responsibility for this and not pass the burden of my waste on to somebody else. So I think first of all, when there's a genuine will, when it's not just, oh, I think I should do this, but I don't really want to, that's going to be really hard to make the switch. But when you've inside gotten there to that point where you say, I've got to make this work somehow. And I think always, when you're really motivated to do something, you try to figure it out. So now I'll give some sort of helpful suggestions. I think there's two real key aspects. One is actually creating a normalizing environment around making that switch. So if you are in a very collective environment, I think it is learning to have those conversations with the people that you're living in community and proximity with, and saying, look, I realize that this might seem uncomfortable for you, but I've decided I want to start using a reusable cloth pad.
Right.
which is going to mean that I'm going to have to dry this somewhere. And I want you to know that, and the reasons I've made this decision is da 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 da, and you explain it, and you try to get them on board with that, so that, you know, they're not, because a big part of it is that we're shy and we feel we can't do that because it will offend others. So in a way, that's our inner, one of those inner humps that we have to get over and communicate. And I think this is as true at a household level as it is at a, you know,
Yes.
hostel dormitory level. So let's say then you've kind of made that step, but you've made the decision, you've had that conversation, everyone's on board. Then the next thing is just simply how you handle it. And I think, you know, it can be a question of, you know, just trying to see and negotiate, is there a space where you can dry it? I'm just going to show you, for example, this is one model of pad which might even be more convenient. So this is the same idea. It's a cloth pad, but instead of having all the padding stitched into one thing, you fold this into like this. So that's your pad, and it's still got leak proofing, it still has wings. But what's really nice about this model is that it dries really quickly. So if, you know, if you need your pad to dry quickly and not hang out for too long, whether it's also monsoon could be another issue, or you're in a place where you're not going to get much access to sun or something like that, a model like this could really work. I would say even another thing that you might want to consider, but again, I don't push any product on anybody. I think you really just have to think about your options and know what they are. There's two other options. One is a menstrual cup, which can be worn internally, and there's no need for washing and drying. I realise this product can be kind of uncomfortable, or there's a lot of fear or concern around an internal product. And again, I say go online, look up menstrual cups, see videos, get familiar. And maybe this is something you want to try. Doesn't require this sort of washing, drying, people negotiation that a cloth pad has. And similarly, now there's period underwear, which is literally like a pair of panties, but it has leak proofing and extra layers for absorbency. So the fact is there are options out there in addition to something like a cloth pad. So I think just in summary, you know, first of all, get clear that you want to make the switch and why, and really own it. Then, you know, you figure out the steps. And if you're lucky enough to find that you're not the only one that wants to use, you might even start a movement of everyone in the hostel going, yeah, let's all do this. I mean, you then might want to, for example, you know, personalize your pad somehow, maybe because you won't get so many unique designs. So maybe you stitch your initials or something on so they don't get muddled up. Yeah.
I understand. So the next question we have is from Kashish, and she has asked that you mentioned this in the beginning, that it is universal, but it's quite apparent for a developing country like India, where culture is predominant, right? But even developed economies struggle with adapting to something like talks about menstruation, or, you know, using something like a cloth pad for menstruation. Why is it even an issue in developed economies, where, you know, they are supposed to be really liberal, but facts don't suggest the same?
No. Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I mean, I suppose in a way, I think we're all, you know, experience the footprint of patriarchy in one way or another. At least I think there's been really lopsided development all over the world. And I think, you know, the sort of extreme capitalistic model, which has led to a lot of exploitation of the earth and, you know, dominance over nature. I mean, it's no accident. This is the same system that has also oppressed women. And maybe there's more the appearance in developed economies and countries of equality. And in many ways, you know, I think it is fair to say that, for example, if you look at the gender pay gap, it's, you know, it's almost non-existent in the West, whereas in India, it's still quite extreme. So, you know, India definitely is lagging behind. But to say that, you know, the West has got this handled and it's just India that has to get up to speed, you know, the West has got a long way to go. And I think we're challenging patriarchal mindset in the West as much as India. There's differences, of course, in the narratives and the particular issues, but it's not to say that these issues are not affecting us in the West too. I think there's a long way to go everywhere. But when it comes to menstruation, it's true, at least in today's younger generation, I would say in the West. I mean, it's rare for me to meet a girl from a Western country who still feels ashamed of menstruation, whereas in India, it's very common. But I know when I got my menstruation first, which is now nearly 40 years ago, I was mortified, you know, like I was so embarrassed. I was really imprinted with this shaming that was, it was like the water I swim in, you know. I thought I would die if my father or brother would know about it. You know, exactly the same as what I see here in India. So I suppose I can really empathize with that as well. It's changed fast. And I think what's super exciting for me with this whole movement is that we've been doing this now for 10 years. And I'm
Right.
astonished at how quickly this conversation is progressing. Like, really, I think, you know, we can sometimes go, oh, it's so slow and there's so many hurdles to overcome. And yes, they are. But I personally feel very encouraged by also how quickly change could come, how many, you know, people identify themselves as menstrual activists, how quickly the movement around reusable menstrual products has kind of caught fire. So I'm very hopeful that we're going to continue to see great progress in this topic. And maybe it is because it's at the intersection of so many of these other interesting topics like environment and culture and gender and all the rest of it. But I think, you know, menstruation, excuse the pun, is quite a juicy area of work. So yes, it's encouraging at the same time.
So it's not wrong to say that there has always been space for a conversation about menstruation. It's just that it's not picking up, right? So there is need for initiative.
I think it's not yet mainstreamed. We're not at a point where, you know, we talk about it like it's just completely normal. There's still a tendency for, you know, hushed tones, but it's come a long way. And I think, yes, everybody can play a role in this. Everybody. It's not, as you know, it's not the domain of a professional or an expert. It's the domain of all of us who have some, you know, this is what I love about this work, is that I feel like it's really equalized because it's a lived human experience, you know, whether we're having it as a direct experience or we know somebody who's having it. But I think it's a gateway into such a human conversation. And I think this is where we really learn to build bridges of understanding between genders and between each other.
Thank you. So this next question is from Dia, and she has asked, how do you educate people about the 4 seasons of menstruation or the 4 seasons of a period? Basically, so we're talking about PMS and everything before that, because when a woman starts menstruating, there's a lot of hormonal changes, right? And that's a lot to tackle when you first start menstruating. So how do you go about tackling that?
Yeah, I'm so glad this question's come up because I find it one of the most interesting aspects in a way. And I think one of the problems with the way in which we've framed menstrual education is more or less that it's focused on the overt phase of bleeding, and it's become reduced to, like, even in the sector, it's been called menstrual hygiene management, as if all it is a hygiene topic. It has to be managed. And I think menstruation as a phenomenon is so much more interesting and rich because it is a cyclical phenomenon. And as, I'm sorry, what was the question? Who was the name of the questioner?
Dia.
Who asked the question?
Dia.
Yeah, Dia. So Dia is, as Dia's asking, you know, I think this metaphor of 4 seasons is one of the most beautiful images that I've come across too for talking about menstruation. And so we talk about it like this. I suppose we always include this aspect when we do menstruation education. And first of all, that it is a cyclical phenomenon. And so the idea being that that just after we've been bleeding, this is kind of like the pre-ovulation phase. This could be compared with something like spring. And again, I think the key message here is you understand this when you start to track your cycle, when you start to pay attention. And even that is part of the problem, is that we've so been taught to reject and deny menstruation that we like look away from it. And in fact, it's such a rich part of our experience. So if we actually look to it and start tracking, even if it's simply with an app, but you can even go more in detail and really just note each day, what am I feeling? How's my energy? am I having special dreams, whatever. But you start to pay attention and look at that over time, over 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, you'll start to observe patterns. So the pattern is more or less, and it will be variable, but usually there's this kind of feeling of much more energy and lightness, which also corresponds with the hormones at the different phases too. But it's something like a spring. There's more heightened energy to be outgoing and in the world. And then coming up to ovulation is kind of summer, and it's sort of like this peak time, which is also the most fertile time. And then after ovulation, then there is a kind of dipping of energies, and this is when we're moving more into the pre-menstrual phase. And sometimes we notice that as kind of a little bit more irritability or something like this. Again, everybody's experience is a bit different, but this is also kind of a call within. It's the time for sort of like slowing down and dormancy, and just like the seasons of life. And we're not always in eternal spring. These seasons are asking us to maybe slow down a bit and prepare, regenerate, because we're heading up to this really quite significant event of menstruation, shedding, and there's a big inner change that's going hormonally, physically. And we know when it's menstruating, which can be like the winter bleed time, is really when our energies are most internal and most drawn in. And why I love this imagery so much is because I think, again, coming back to this idea of patriarchy, I think we've all been so conditioned to expect like a perpetual spring, like we always have to be performing at peak consistently all the time. And yet anybody who lives in a hormonal body knows that that's just not our reality. And in fact, it's nature's reality, the moon, I mean, waxing, waning, seasonal changes. This is nature. And our bodies, in this sense, are hardwired to attune ourselves to this aspect of nature. So I think really this is part of the restoring of the feminine balancing in the world. And I think menstruation is even a gateway for that. If we can learn to be more sensitive to and attune to these menstrual phases and be curious about them and honor them, and not just try to override our bodies and push on and push on. I realize it's difficult because our cultures are not set up to allow this time of regeneration. But I can say personally, I feel like that's one of the gifts of this COVID time, is it's forced us all to stop. And I know that's been very difficult in many, many ways, but perhaps it's also given us a window of opportunity to sense into what slowing down, what the gifts of slowing down can be. And I think menstruation has this kind of built-in mechanism if we can learn to pay attention.
So our next question is from Nikhil Chopra, and he asks how to make a menstruator comfortable and take care of them.
I think, again, it's the same formula. Ask them. I think, first of all, I think this is also oftentimes, everybody's experience is different. So I'd say you go up to whoever that menstruator is in your life, and you just ask them that question. I'm curious. I know you go through this experience. Is there anything I can do to help make your experience more comfortable? I think what is very nice, if I think most women would genuinely appreciate it if the man or carer in their life would take over the cooking or some of the extra sort of physical chores when they're actually on their bleed. I think this is probably appreciated a lot. And, it's variable. Some people go through very little pain and discomfort when they're menstruating. Some people go through horrendous pain and discomfort. Everybody's experience is different. So this is why I think you can't generalize too much. Get to know the menstruators in your life and ask them, have that conversation. Curiosity, humility, empathy.
So there's a follow-up question here. Do you think menstrual education is equally important for men as it is for women to make them equipped to help their female counterpart?
Yes, and I think that there's some differences too in maybe what's required. And also, I think I'm a real big believer in context. So, for example, the way we will have this conversation to maybe girls in rural in government schools who may be having this conversation for the first time, I do think it's really important to give a girl only space for that conversation, because there's so much inhibiting shyness, and anxiety, and in the minute you'll put a boy in the room, they'll be obviously feel more confident and maybe override or be, not give the girls the space to ask the questions, or they may be just so damned embarrassed that they're not coming through. So I think, certainly for girls, I tend to see that having girl only spaces maybe for this first conversation is really important. You really want to honor that need for her to feel really safe and comfortable to ask her questions and understand what's going on and not feel kind of anxious. And again, I hope a time will come maybe when that will be different. But I think the reality today is that we're not there yet. So giving spaces for girls and even sometimes women only, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I do think it's important that more boys are not kept out of the conversation. Again, I think a lot of unfortunate consequences have happened. I meet so many, especially young guys who really want to be allies of the women in their lives, but they feel kind of really almost shy and embarrassed because no one's ever explained. They'll all tell you about these stories of the aunties or their mothers that disappeared every month. And it was like the elephant in the room, the big kept secret, that somewhere they found out that she was menstruating, but no one ever said it to them directly. And so there was this mysterious element around that. And it's kind of, and with that goes this feeling I'm not supposed to know. And I don't think that's really helpful. So again, I think we all have to get better at just having honest and frank conversations that are not, in hush-hush tones and that are not euphemistic. And like anything that's a new conversation and maybe a difficult conversation, take it slow, take it comfortable, build experience until it becomes really natural and easy. But yeah, I think with guys, with boys and men, it's sort of just like giving permission to be able to ask their questions as well, and not to feel like they should know we've paid not to know. And yeah,
it's actually,
we can help each other on that.
It's the women who actually help the boys become comfortable with menstruation also then.
I think we have to take a lead role in this. I do. I think this is where women and girls have to learn to step up. And this is the lovely thing that I see about these sort of educational programs with the girls is once they've kind of gone through such a session, and especially if they've had practice, to ask questions and speak out loud, I think this is one of the things is learning to use the voice and speak. And again, demystify it. It's not that, this is expert knowledge. This is embodied knowledge. And once they feel comfortable, they're proud to be the one in the family that explains it to their younger sisters or even to, their brothers. And there's a way in which I think this culture can really shift. And, this is the power really does. This sharing, not in any kind of putting down way and not shaming, but just engaging that conversation.
So, Kathy, I have a list of questions here in the chat box that I think would require, they would require attention, but then I completely lost track of time talking to you.
I probably talked too much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kathy, for addressing all these questions, having such a delightful conversation with us. I think important for us, everybody here. We come to an end of this discussion, but before we leave,
thing? Because I would personally love to answer all the questions, but realize this is not possible. But I can, I could direct people with questions to a few places, like obviously our website, which is ecofemme.org. We've got a very kind of extensive blog and, FAQ section. So there's a lot of stuff about products, but also about why make the switch, about conversations with men and boys. I mean, obviously we're on Instagram and things like that. And there's, for example, I think there's a really, I've just been looking through myself. It's called menstrual/matters.com. And they've got a fantastic blog, and they're talking about all sorts of issues. For example, period leave, which was one of the topics we wanted to talk about today. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff there also on these equity issues. So I just wanted to flag those things, given we're not going to have the time to talk about answer all the questions.
Thank you so much, Kathy. But before we leave, I'd really like our president to give a vote of thanks and formally end it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vedika. On the behalf of the entire team, I would like to extend my gratitude and thank Kathy for sparing her valuable time and gracing us today. It was indeed an enlightening session. Thank you to all of you who joined us, without whose support this wouldn't have been possible. Also, we would like to declare the topic for the forthcoming month is representation of inequality through visual media. Looking forward to seeing you all in the upcoming